Mr. President, political speech is not on the fringes of the First Amendment. It's the core freedom of democracy. The entire point of the First Amendment is to say that the government has no business telling the citizens what constitutes reasonable political speech. Congress is not allowed to ban books. Congress isn't allowed to ban magazines or pamphlets. And Congress is not allowed to silence dissent. The idea behind this amendment is that government should have the power to silence criticism of the government. This amendment referring to Senate Joint Resolution 19. It's an attempt to control the words Americans speak and the ideas that Americans hear. Every great movement in our democracy has been based on ideas that were, at one time or another, at the outset, deemed unreasonable by the government. It's dangerous and it's un-American in the extreme. Under this proposed amendment, the federal government would have the power to decide which groups, which causes, which arguments, and ultimately which citizens would be allowed to enter the public square. The amendment would even empower Congress to distinguish between natural individuals and artificial entities. That is, rich and powerful people will still be free to influence our government, but everyone else can be barred from coming together and pooling their resources for that very purpose. What is an artificial entity with restricted speech rights? Churches, neighborhood associations, civic groups, single-issue organizations like National Right to Life or NARAL, trade associations, businesses, or labor unions, schools. The target of this amendment is America, civil society. When politicians talk about outside groups, they mean outside Washington. They mean ordinary citizens coming together, rallying behind a common cause. They mean the abolition movement, the women's suffrage movement, and the labor movement, as well as the civil rights movement, anti-war movements, the pro-life movement, and the consumer rights movement. They mean citizens. That's who the authors of this amendment believe are outside intruders, whose speech somehow needs to be regulated, needs to be restricted by Congress. People with ideas that are quote-unquote unreasonable, people like Thomas Paine or Thomas Jefferson and Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony and Martin Luther King, Jr. The true danger of the idea is even put into the text in the Section 3 carve-out for the press. So wealthy individuals, those who happen to own newspapers or happen to own a television station or a radio network, do, under this proposed amendment, continue to have free speech. But the people who read and watch the media do not? Or the people who don't own those companies, don't they have the same rights? Under this proposed amendment, they would not. This is Orwellian. Under this amendment, Congress could establish a federal ministry of truth of sorts to monitor the political speech of citizens to make sure that they're reasonable, to make sure that the activities in which they engage, those that are attempted to influence elections, are in fact reasonable. Congress would of course be empowered to define what constitutes journalism, what falls within the parameters of this freedom of the press carve-out, so that irritating bloggers and reporters and producers could perhaps be silenced, assuming they were carved out of that definition. This provision will not guarantee equality. It will rather guarantee inequality. It's right there in the text of the amendment. Some citizens' right to free speech would be more equal than others under this proposed amendment. It's sometimes appealing at a surface level to start from the proposition that something like this might be desirable to some, for the simple reason that we don't want any one person or any one group of persons having a disproportionate impact on the electoral process. We don't want anyone or anything to be able to buy an election. But that misses the point. This wouldn't solve that problem. In fact, this would make that problem worse. Consider, for example, the fact that under this proposed amendment, as I read it and as I think most would read it, an individual would be free to spend unlimited amounts of money, thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions or tens of millions of dollars, supporting the candidate of her choice if that individual happened to own a newspaper, or if that individual perhaps happened to own a television company or a radio broadcast network. That would be no problem. That would be beyond the scope of this proposed amendment, because under Section 3 of Senate Joint Resolution 19, it makes clear that nothing in this article shall be construed to grant Congress or the states the power to abridge the freedom of the press. So, in light of Section 3, everything else in Senate Joint Resolution 19 might either do a lot or it might do a little. It might do practically nothing or it might do practically everything. Let me explain what I mean. Let's examine the text of the first two sections of this provision. Section 1 says, to advance democratic self-government and political equality and to protect the integrity of government and the electoral process, Congress and the states may regulate and set reasonable limits on the raising and spending of money by candidates and others to influence elections. So if your intent is deemed to involve influencing the outcome of an election, then you're subject to these reasonable limits. Well, what people in Congress think is reasonable might be different than what the American people think is reasonable. Then in Section 2, it says that Congress and the states shall have power to implement and enforce this article by appropriate legislation, and may distinguish between natural persons and corporations or other artificial entities created by law, including by prohibiting such entities from spending money to influence elections. Herein lies the problem. Getting back to our hypothetical a few minutes ago, if the idea behind this is to prevent any person or any group of persons from having too much influence over elections taking place in the United States of America, this doesn't do that. And depending on how broadly or how narrowly Congress chooses to define this concept of freedom of the press, which it carves out and holds harmless, this legislation might do everything or it might do nothing. Let me explain what I mean. Most of the money that is spent by political campaigns, whether by individual candidates or by organizations attempting to influence the outcome of elections, comes in the form of disseminating a message, comes in the form of either printed material, in the form of pamphlets, or the electronic equivalent of pamphlets, or comes in the form of some type of advertisement. Maybe it's an advertisement in a newspaper, maybe it's an advertisement on television, but that's where most political money ends up getting spent. As understood by the founding generation and as understood and interpreted by the Supreme Court to this day, most of that material is protected in the sense that most of that material constitutes something that falls under the category of freedom of the press. Freedom of the press, of course, doesn't belong solely, doesn't belong exclusively to those who have a press badge or those who are part of what has historically been considered our news media. If, on the other hand, those who have drafted this amendment, or if, on the other hand, those who would decide what laws to pass under this amendment, to give it force, If they were to conclude that they wanted to more narrowly define press to include only credentialed media, perhaps newspaper reporters and radio and television reporters, then they would be significantly changing the First Amendment as interpreted by the Supreme Court. They would be significantly changing the nature of freedom of the press as recognized by the Supreme Court over the last 2 centuries. If, in fact, they choose to do it that way, then we would find ourselves in an awful situation in which the owner of a newspaper would be able to spend potentially millions, perhaps tens of millions of dollars promoting the candidate of her choice simply because she owns a newspaper. But what about somebody who doesn't own a newspaper, but nonetheless wants her views to be expressed, wants to have some way of contributing to the national debate? What if there's someone out there who is really concerned about a particular issue? Let's say that there's a voter who is concerned about the Patriot Act, and she wants to contribute to an organization, let's say the ACLU, which would in turn perhaps make statements to try to influence the public debate about the Patriot Act. This could run afoul of that. In fact, under the plain language of it, it likely would. And in fact, the ACLU itself has expressed this concern in a letter dated June 3rd, 2014, to Chairman Pat Leahy of the Senate Judiciary Committee, on which I sit. Page 4 of that letter, the ACLU presents the following hypothetical. For instance, would an ACLU ad urging members of Congress to support Patriot Act reform, which runs shortly before the November 2004 election, when that issue is at play in the election, be construed as an issue ad exhorting voters to support reform, or a covert attempt to influence voters to oppose members who do not support reform? Similarly, would an ad by a group urging repeal of the Affordable Care Act, which runs before the 2012 presidential election, be issue advocacy or covert express advocacy? These are questions raised by the ACLU itself. These are questions.
The senator's time has expired.
I ask unanimous consent by be given 2 additional minutes to wrap up my remarks.
Without objection.
And so, Mr. President, what all of this boils down to is that the core value, the core protections underlying the First Amendment are not just important, they're not just nice things to talk about. They're at the very foundation of our representative democracy. They're at the very foundation of our republic and how it operates. If this amendment were to pass, if this were to become part of the Constitution of the United States, Congress would become more powerful at the expense of the American people. Ultimately, this would inure to the benefit of the political establishment in Washington. It would inure to the benefit, perhaps, of 2 political parties, but everybody else would suffer. It would be more difficult for more Americans to speak on issues that concern them. Congress would have more power, and the states would have more power to restrict the speech of the American people. It has been said in the past that this is about restricting money, not speech. That's a little bit like saying that a city ordinance prohibiting people from using either an automobile or a subway car to get to a protest rally isn't restricting their access to a protest rally or the right to participate in that protest rally. When money is the means by which the American people can have the ability to express their concern on an issue that voters are facing in an upcoming election, that should concern us all. This is an attempt to weaken the most fundamental components of our rights as U.S. citizens. I must therefore oppose Senate Joint Resolution 19 and urge my colleagues to do the same. Thank you, Mr. President.